My name is Margaret Miller, and at 32, I thought I understood the rhythms of Blue Water Hospital. As a clinical documentation specialist here in Coastal View, South Carolina, I'd spent 4 years navigating the maze of medical records, insurance authorizations, and compliance audits that kept our 400-bed facility running smoothly. The salt air from the nearby Atlantic seemed to permeate everything. Even the sterile corridors carried a hint of ocean breeze when the windows opened during shift changes. Blue Water Hospital had always prided itself on being a tight-knit community hospital. Unlike the massive medical centers in Charleston, we knew each other's names, remembered birthdays, and covered shifts without complaint. The morning huddles in the documentation department felt more like family meetings than corporate briefings. Jennifer Lewis, our department supervisor, would distribute the daily census reports while sharing updates about her daughter's soccer games. Gregory Lewis, one of our patient care technicians who'd transferred from the float pool 6 months ago, always brought coffee for the early shift, a gesture that seemed genuine in a profession where small kindnesses mattered. The first sign something was amiss came during a routine audit in late September. I was reviewing certification reimbursement claims when I noticed an unusual pattern in the float pool incentive calculations. Gregory had been overseeing these payments since his transfer, and the numbers seemed off. Not dramatically wrong, but inconsistent in ways that made my documentation-trained eye pause. When I mentioned it to Jennifer during our weekly one-on-one, she brushed it aside with a tired smile. Margaret, you know how complex those float pool calculations can be. Gregory's been doing excellent work transitioning from direct patient care to administrative duties. Sometimes the learning curve shows in the paperwork. But the feeling persisted. Small discrepancies in timesheet submissions. Certification renewal dates that didn't align with our internal tracking system. Gregory's sudden interest in discussing my continuing education credits during casual conversations in the break room. He'd ask detailed questions about my recent AHIMA certification renewal, the costs involved, the reimbursement timeline, questions that felt too specific for casual interest. The hospital's Epic system showed everything, if you knew where to look. As someone responsible for ensuring accurate documentation, I had access to various modules that most staff never saw. During quiet afternoon shifts, I found myself pulling reports that had nothing to do with my assigned cases. The patterns were subtle, buried in the administrative noise that surrounded every healthcare facility, but they were there. By October, the unease had settled into my daily routine like an unwelcome companion. I'd catch myself double-checking locks on my desk drawers, being more careful about leaving sensitive documents unattended. The easy camaraderie I'd always shared with Gregory began to feel forced. His friendly questions now carrying an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, when I stayed late to finish a particularly complex case review. The documentation department was empty except for the cleaning crew, and I was deep in concentration when I heard the soft beep of a badge scanner at the department entrance. Through the frosted glass of my office door, I saw Gregory's silhouette moving between the cubicles. Not unusual, except his shift had ended 3 hours earlier. I sat perfectly still, watching as he approached my workstation. The glow from his phone screen illuminated his face as he photographed something on my desk. My certification renewal documents. The ones I'd left out to file the next morning, containing my personal information, renewal fees, and reimbursement authorization codes. The ocean breeze that night carried more than salt air. It carried the weight of betrayal, and I finally understood that the patterns I'd been seeing weren't coincidences at all. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made Coastal View feel like a postcard. I arrived at Blue Water Hospital 30 minutes early, as had become my habit since joining the documentation team 18 months ago. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for the night shift vehicles and a few early arrivals like myself. Gregory Lewis had been my mentor from day one. As the senior patient care technician overseeing the float pool, he'd taken me under his wing when I was still navigating the maze of hospital protocols and Epic system modules. His easy smile and patient explanations had made those first overwhelming weeks bearable. When I struggled with the complex reimbursement tracking systems, Gregory stayed after his shift to walk me through the processes. When I questioned whether I belonged in healthcare administration, he reminded me that attention to detail was exactly what the field needed. Documentation is the backbone of everything we do here, he'd told me during my second week, leaning against my cubicle with a coffee cup that read World's Okayest Tech. Without accurate records, the whole system falls apart. You're protecting patients, protecting the hospital, protecting everyone. I'd believed him completely. Gregory had 15 years of experience at Blue Water, had worked his way up from entry-level positions, and commanded respect from staff across multiple departments. When he recommended me for additional training modules, I trusted his judgment. When he suggested I pursue my AHIMA certification, I followed his advice without question. The float pool incentive payment calculations were Gregory's specialty. He oversaw the complex system that tracked temporary staff assignments, calculated bonus payments, and managed the reimbursement requests that kept our staffing flexible. It was detail-oriented work that required access to sensitive payroll information and employee records. Gregory handled it all with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Our friendship had developed naturally over shared lunch breaks and late-night documentation sessions. He knew about my student loans, my small apartment near the harbor, my weekend volunteer work at the animal shelter. I knew about his daughter's college applications, his weekend fishing trips, his pride in working his way up without a formal degree. We'd developed the easy rapport of colleagues who genuinely respected each other's work. That trust made the small inconsistencies harder to recognize at first. It started with comments that seemed supportive but felt slightly off. When I mentioned the cost of my certification renewal, nearly $800, Gregory's response was immediate and detailed. The hospital should cover that completely. Make sure you submit everything through the continuing education portal. Don't let them shortchange you on the reimbursement timeline either. I've seen them drag their feet on payments. His knowledge of the reimbursement process seemed extensive, but then again, he worked with financial systems daily. When he offered to help me navigate the submission process, it felt like the natural extension of his mentorship. The forms can be tricky, he'd explained, pulling up the portal on his computer during our lunch break. See this section here? Most people miss the additional documentation requirements. You need to upload your completion certificate, the payment receipt, and the continuing education credit verification. Miss any of those, and they'll kick it back for weeks. I'd watched him navigate the system with practiced ease, noting which fields were required, which documents needed specific formatting. His helpfulness felt genuine, his expertise obvious. When he suggested I email him copies of my documents, just to double-check everything before submission, it seemed like reasonable precaution. The first real warning sign came 3 weeks later, during a staff meeting about budget allocations. Jennifer Martinez from Human Resources was discussing the continuing education reimbursement program when she mentioned an unusual pattern in recent submissions. We've seen an uptick in certification renewal requests, she said, consulting her tablet. Nothing concerning, but we're implementing additional verification steps to ensure accuracy. Some duplicate submissions have created processing delays. I glanced at Gregory, expecting to see his usual attentive expression during administrative discussions. Instead, he was staring at his hands, jaw tight in a way I'd never seen before. When Jennifer asked if anyone had questions about the new verification process, Gregory remained silent. After the meeting, I approached him in the hallway. Everything okay? You seem tense in there. His smile returned, but it felt forced. Just tired, long week, you know? But I did know Gregory, and tired didn't make him avoid eye contact. The second warning came when I tried to check the status of my reimbursement request. The continuing education portal showed my submission as pending review, which seemed normal for the 3-week timeframe Jennifer had mentioned. But when I called the benefits office directly, the representative couldn't locate my request in their system. Let me check our recent submissions, she said, keyboard clicking in the background. Miller, Margaret. I'm not seeing anything under your employee ID for the past 6 months. Are you sure it was submitted correctly? I assured her it was and promised to resubmit if necessary, but the conversation left me unsettled. Gregory had walked me through the submission process personally. We'd double-checked every field, every uploaded document. There was no way the request had been submitted incorrectly. That evening, I stayed late to review my submission history in the portal. The documentation was there. My certification renewal request, submitted 6 weeks ago, showing all required documents attached. But something felt wrong about the timestamp. The submission showed 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, but I distinctly remembered submitting it during my lunch break on Wednesday afternoon. I pulled up my email history, searching for the confirmation message that should have been automatically generated. It wasn't there. No confirmation email, no receipt number, no acknowledgement that my request had been received. The pieces began forming a picture I didn't want to see. Gregory's detailed knowledge of the reimbursement system, his insistence on helping with my submission, his request for copies of my documents, his strange behavior during the staff meeting about duplicate submissions. I spent the weekend researching the hospital's financial systems, reading policy manuals I'd never needed before, understanding the flow of reimbursement requests from submission to approval. What I learned made my stomach turn. The continuing education portal had multiple access levels. Basic employees could submit requests and check status. Department supervisors could review and approve requests within their areas. But system administrators, like those who managed float pool incentives, had broader access. They could modify submissions, redirect payments, even create duplicate requests under different employee IDs. Monday morning brought a cold rain that matched my mood. I arrived early again, but this time with purpose. The Epic Systems audit trail function was something I'd learned about during my training but never needed to use. It tracked every action taken within the system, every login, every modification, every access attempt. I pulled my own audit trail first, confirming what I already suspected. My certification reimbursement request had been accessed multiple times after my initial submission, accessed by someone with administrative privileges, modified in ways that redirected the payment authorization to a different account. The account belonged to Gregory Lewis. But that wasn't all. The audit trail showed a pattern of similar modifications spanning the past 18 months. Certification renewals, continuing education courses, professional development workshops, dozens of reimbursement requests that had been subtly altered, their payments redirected to accounts controlled by Gregory. He hadn't just stolen from me. He'd been systematically falsifying certification reimbursement claims across multiple departments, using his administrative access to redirect payments meant for other employees. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate detection, a few $100s here, $1,000 there, but they added up to tens of thousands of dollars over time. I sat in my cubicle, staring at the evidence on my screen, feeling the weight of betrayal settle into my chest. Gregory hadn't just violated my trust. He'd built our entire friendship on a foundation of theft. Every helpful suggestion, every mentoring moment, every piece of advice had been calculated to give him access to information he could exploit. The man who'd taught me that documentation was about protecting people had been using that same documentation to steal from them. The evidence burned on my screen like an accusation. I printed everything: audit trails, payment redirections, the systematic pattern of theft that Gregory Lewis had orchestrated. My hands shook as I organized the documents, but my resolve remained steady. I needed an ally, someone I could trust completely. Jennifer Martinez came to mind immediately. As the quality assurance coordinator, she had both the authority and the integrity to handle this situation properly. More importantly, she'd always been direct with me, never sugarcoating feedback or playing political games. I found Jennifer in her office, reviewing patient satisfaction surveys. She looked up when I knocked, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to concern when she saw my face. "Margaret, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I need to show you something, and I need your advice on how to proceed." I closed her office door and placed the printed documents on her desk. "It's about Gregory Lewis and the float pool incentive calculations." Jennifer's eyebrows rose as she began reading. I watched her expression change from confusion to disbelief to anger as she absorbed the scope of Gregory's theft. She was quiet for a long time, methodically reviewing each page. "This is extensive," she finally said. "How long have you suspected?" "Only since Friday. I started investigating when my certification reimbursement was denied, but the payment had clearly been processed." I explained my discovery process, how I'd traced the audit trail and uncovered the broader pattern. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. "Margaret, this isn't just theft. This is fraud on a massive scale. We're talking about federal health care funds, employee benefits, systematic abuse of administrative privileges." She paused. "How well do you know Gregory personally?" The question hit harder than I expected. I thought I knew him well. He's been my mentor for 2 years, helped me navigate the hospital systems, taught me about documentation protocols. I trusted him completely. "That makes this worse, not better. He used that relationship to gain access to information he needed for these schemes. Jennifer's voice was gentle but firm. We need to report this immediately, but we need to do it right. Hospital administration, HR, and potentially external authorities will all be involved. My stomach clenched. What happens to Gregory? That's not our decision to make. Our responsibility is to report what we've discovered and let the proper authorities investigate. Jennifer gathered the documents. But Margaret, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get complicated quickly. She was right. Within hours of our report to hospital administration, the situation escalated beyond anything I'd anticipated. Chief Financial Officer Jennifer Thompson arrived with 2 investigators from the hospital's compliance department. They sequestered Gregory's workstation, froze his system access, and began a comprehensive audit of all float pool financial transactions. Gregory wasn't in the hospital that day. He'd called in sick, which now seemed suspiciously convenient. The investigators worked through his files methodically, uncovering additional evidence of his schemes. They discovered he'd been creating phantom employee profiles to generate additional reimbursement claims, using his administrative access to approve payments to accounts he controlled. By Wednesday, the scope of the investigation had expanded to include external auditors and legal counsel. The hospital's reputation was at stake, and administration was taking no chances. They implemented immediate changes to the reimbursement approval process, requiring dual authorization for all payments and enhanced audit trails for administrative modifications. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of being both a victim and a key witness. The investigators needed detailed statements about my interactions with Gregory, my discovery process, and any conversations that might be relevant to the case. Each interview felt like reliving the betrayal, forcing me to examine every moment of our professional relationship through the lens of his deception. The hardest part was facing my colleagues' reactions. Word spread quickly through the hospital, as it always does in close-knit environments. Some people were supportive, praising me for uncovering the fraud. Others seemed suspicious, wondering if I'd been involved or if I'd known more than I was admitting. Jennifer Martinez became my anchor during this period. She attended the investigative meetings with me, helped me prepare my statements, and provided the professional support I desperately needed. Her presence reminded me that not everyone in the hospital was motivated by personal gain. You did the right thing, she told me after a particularly difficult interview session. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but exposing this fraud protects everyone who works here. On Friday, Gregory finally returned to the hospital. I saw him in the parking lot, walking toward the employee entrance with his usual confident stride. He didn't know yet that his access had been revoked, that investigators were waiting for him, that his carefully constructed schemes had been exposed. I watched from my office window as security escorted him to the administrative wing. He looked confused, then angry, then resigned as the reality of his situation became clear. Part of me felt sorry for him, the part that remembered his mentorship, his apparent kindness, the professional relationship I'd valued. But that sympathy was overwhelmed by anger at his betrayal. He'd stolen not just money, but trust. He'd corrupted the very systems designed to support employee development and professional growth. He'd turned mentorship into manipulation and used his position of authority to exploit the people who depended on him. The investigation concluded the following week. Gregory Lewis was terminated immediately and escorted from the premises. The hospital recovered some of the stolen funds through insurance and legal action, but the full amount would likely never be recovered. More importantly, the systems he'd exploited were redesigned to prevent similar fraud in the future. I learned later that Gregory had been facing significant personal financial pressures: medical bills for a family member, mortgage difficulties, credit card debt. The investigators suggested these pressures had motivated his initial theft, which then escalated as he became more comfortable with the deception and more skilled at avoiding detection. Understanding his motivation didn't excuse his actions, but it helped me process the betrayal. Gregory hadn't started as a criminal. He'd become one through a series of choices that prioritized his immediate needs over his professional integrity and personal relationships. The aftermath left me emotionally drained, but professionally vindicated. Hospital administration publicly acknowledged my role in exposing the fraud, and several colleagues who'd initially been suspicious now approached me with apologies and respect. But the victory felt hollow. I'd lost a mentor, a friend, and my faith in the systems I'd trusted to protect us all. 8 months later, I stood in my new office at Coastal Regional Medical Center, 30 miles north of Blue Water Hospital. The morning sun streamed through larger windows, illuminating the certification audit protocols I developed, comprehensive systems designed to prevent the kind of fraud that had shattered my trust in healthcare administration. As the newly appointed Director of Compliance and Reimbursement Integrity, I'd spent the past 6 months building something meaningful from the wreckage of my experience with Gregory Lewis. The position had been created specifically for me after Coastal Regional's board learned about my role in exposing the certification fraud at Blue Water. My days now involved training department heads on proper documentation procedures, implementing dual approval systems for all reimbursement claims, and conducting quarterly audits of employee certification records. I created audit systems for healthcare expense reimbursements that included random sampling, cross-referencing with external certification bodies, and mandatory supervisor verification for all claims above $50. The work was methodical, sometimes tedious, but deeply satisfying. Every protocol I established, every safeguard I implemented, represented a barrier against the kind of betrayal I'd experienced. Other healthcare professionals would be protected from the violation of trust that had nearly destroyed my faith in our profession. Jennifer Lewis, my new administrative assistant, had proven invaluable in establishing these systems. Unlike her predecessor at Blue Water, she approached every task with transparency and attention to detail that rebuilt my confidence in collaborative work. When she processed reimbursement requests, she documented every step, maintained clear paper trails, and never hesitated to ask questions when something seemed unclear. The healing hadn't been immediate or complete. For months after leaving Blue Water, I'd found myself double-checking every administrative interaction, questioning colleagues' motives, and maintaining emotional distance from potential mentors. Trust, once broken so completely, required careful reconstruction. But gradually, through consistent positive experiences and the meaningful work of protecting others, my faith in healthcare administration had returned. Not the naive trust I'd once possessed, but something stronger. Trust tempered by wisdom, relationships built on verified integrity rather than assumed goodness. Last month, I'd received a letter from the South Carolina Board of Health commending my fraud detection work and requesting my input on statewide certification oversight improvements. The recognition felt validating, but more importantly, it represented systemic change that would protect healthcare workers across the state. I'd also heard through professional networks that Gregory Lewis had been convicted of fraud and sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. The news brought no satisfaction, only a sense of closure. His choices had consequences, as they should, but I'd moved beyond anger into something more productive. My new team respected the systems I'd established without questioning my authority or undermining my decisions. Department heads appreciated the clarity of our new protocols, even when they initially complained about additional paperwork. The hospital's chief financial officer had publicly praised our fraud prevention measures during the quarterly board meeting. As I reviewed the morning's audit reports, I reflected on how completely my professional life had transformed. The betrayal that had once felt devastating had ultimately led to more meaningful work, greater responsibility, and the opportunity to protect others from similar violations of trust. The silence in my office was different now, not the oppressive quiet of secrets and deception, but the peaceful calm of honest work and clear conscience. I'd found my place in healthcare administration again, not despite the betrayal I'd experienced, but because of how I'd chosen to respond to it. Outside my window, I could see the morning shift change beginning at Coastal Regional. Healthcare workers arriving for another day of caring for patients, trusting that the systems supporting them were honest and reliable. Because of the work I'd done, that trust was better protected. It was finally over, and the silence felt earned.